very much, Claire. And I think that the issue of free speech is a very contested topic at the moment. It's a topic that is never far from the headlines, from the mainstream news, media, and so on. And actually, because of how contested the issue is, it can actually lead to very heated disagreements, arguments, debates, and so on. And obviously, it won't be a surprise to anyone here, but at Marxism, we celebrate these sorts of discussions, debates, and so on. And I really hope this meeting will be no different, because I think it's an issue that we as the left need a level of clarity on. We need to thrash out what all the sort of developments are around free speech at the moment and come to a unified conclusion. And the first point that I want to make in this meeting, and I think it is the most important point when talking about the issue of free speech at the moment, is that I think it's impossible to divorce the question of free speech in this current day and age from the global rise of the far right. The far right is one of the most dangerous challenges we face really since the 1930s. And you see, whether it's Donald Trump in America or Tommy Robinson here in the UK, the far right are using the issue of free speech as a thin wedge in which they can try and reach a much broader audience than their smaller fascist or racist base. You see, it's important to recognise that free speech is another part of the rebranding, the reconstruction of the far right on a global scale. You see, it won't be news to anyone in this room, but the legacy of the 1930s, of Hitler, of Auschwitz, of the Holocaust, and so on, there is a general popular opinion that these things were bad things. And when fascists come out in the streets today, they never come out and say, oh, the Holocaust was a good thing, although there are some people some fascists that do make that argument. But you see, across the world, the narrative from the far right is the same. They paint themselves out as the defenders of free speech, as the defenders of traditional values, of European values, of often Christian values, against left-wing, intolerable left-wing students, Islam as a race, and so on. And here in Britain, I think we've seen this most clearly around the likes of Tommy Robinson and Katie Hopkins, who really argue that British values are under attack from intolerant Muslims and Islam as a race. You know, it's the same argument that Trump employs in the US. It's the same argument that Salvini raises in Italy when talking about the so-called refugee crisis. And it's the same argument that Le Pen pushes in France, just across the channel. And you see, I think we as the left have to absolutely reject this narrative. You see, there is a massive difference between freedom of speech and hate speech. Freedom of speech doesn't just give you a license to attack, to demonise, to racialise people based on the colour of their skin, on their religion, on their cultural background, and their gender and sexual orientation. And you see, we have to expose these bigots for what they are: sexist, racist, and so on. And that difference is important. And you see, we as the left obviously have to call out hate speech, oppression in all of its forms, and every time it raises its head. You see, the title of this meeting is the Snowflake generation. A snowflake is a sort of blanket term that the far right use really to describe anyone who disagrees with them. I think the sort of analogy is a snowflake melts away when faced with facts and so on. And really the argument is that the left can't handle the truth. They can't handle the truth around these issues. I do find it quite funny though, this argument, the snowflake, because actually, more and often than not, it's actually the far right that seem to lose any sort of, ability to control themselves when faced with any sort of, any sort of facts. I mean, the best example I saw of this was a tweet from Piers Morgan, which actually I have to say was very quickly deleted, because even he was so embarrassed by it. But it was actually about the sort of, I don't know if people saw about the Greggs vegan sausage roll. Now, Piers Morgan tweeted, without a hint of irony, that the British sausage roll is an institution in itself. what we are seeing is an attack on the British identity. What will be the next victim of political correctness? #wake up. Now, on one level, this is laughable, and it does make me think: are we the snowflakes? Actually, I think vegan people are allowed to have vegan sausage rolls. We're not the ones that sort of, lose our shit over that stuff. But you see, what was interesting is the far right comments underneath. All of them were Islamophobic in nature. Really, that this is about Muslims taking over London, taking over Britain, they can't deal with pork, and so on. All ridiculous. But there is a serious point here. Because we as the left, we as socialists, even, people, we obviously in the SWP are revolutionaries, we want to fight for a different system other than capitalism. But even people who are left reformists, people who want to tinker with the capitalist system, our demands actually, I don't think, are that sort of triggering. We want equal pay in the workplace for women. We want abortion rights on demand. We want decent pay and living standards for ordinary people. And actually, the fact that the far right seem to be so-called triggered over these issues, it does beg the question who the real snowflake is in this debate. But you see, the other sort of part of the meeting that I thought was interesting when reading up on this meeting was really actually the legacy of free speech and how historically free speech has actually been a movement absolutely from ordinary people at the bottom of society to organise against, to mobilise against those people at the top. Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, one of his most famous pieces, said the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. So in other words, in every period of history, whether it's feudalism, capitalism, etc., there has always been a battle of ideas, and there has always been contending classes that try and battle out over those ideas. And free speech has been absolutely part of that struggle. Just to give you a few examples, in 1301, during the Peasants' Revolt, the leader of the Peasants' Revolt, Wat Tyler, was cited to be used free speech as a watchword to sort of rev up peasants to fight back against the feudal landlords and their imposition of taxes on their lands. During the English Civil War, that got rid of the aristocracy and the divine rule of kings and so on. Free speech was a word that was constantly used by John Lilburne, the Levellers, and actually, set down the basis for Parliament and the erection of Parliament after the English Civil War, which was the basis of bourgeois society. Karl Marx himself, in his early years, was an ardent advocate of the free press, separated from the state, and so on. In the civil rights movement, or the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, both Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela constantly referred to the need of free speech on the Jim Crow laws or against the apartheid regime. So in other words, what you see is that free speech has, throughout history, actually been a progressive movement that has actually given people the ability and the belief in which to organise against the status quo and the system that they face. And you see, that's why I find it almost disgusting very disgusting, that actually people like Tommy Robinson, Donald Trump, Katie Hopkins and the far right across the world seek to hijack that movement. They seek to reclaim the free speech movement as a basis in which to demonise, to attack, to racialise and spread their racist and bigoted ideas on a mass sort of level. And you see, I think this is part of the problem with what is seen as a sort of the liberal argument around free speech, is that really the basis comes from Voltaire, which is, I can't ever remember the quote word for word, but it's, I don't agree with what you say, but I will defend your right to say it on any sort of level. You can see how this absolutely can be hijacked by the far right, as which to say, we are the ones under attack, we have the right to be racist, sexist, bigoted, and so on. And you only need to scratch beneath the surface of the lies that the alt-right put out around these issues. And you can take the Greggs vegan sausage roll, but the more serious issues like, Muslim grooming gangs, Londonistan under Sadiq Khan, and so on. You only need to scratch below the surface to see how untrue this is. Actually, I think the re-emergence of the far right around Trump and the other far-right ideologues has actually pulled forces that used to occupy the centre ground of politics to the right. You only need to see Boris Johnson, for example, and his comments that are now, about Muslim women looking like letterboxes, bank robbers, that black people have watermelon smiles, that LGBT men are bum boys. This is the person who is going to be the next Prime Minister of the UK. You can see how that centre ground is being pulled to the right. And it does confuse me a bit that actually the far right have this narrative that somehow the world is biased to the left. I mean, I wish it was. You know what I mean? I wish we lived in a world where actually left-wing ideas were the most popular and dominant ideas within society. Actually, we wouldn't need Marxism. We'd be out on the streets ripping the heads off, the bankers and the capitalist system. But you see, it's interesting though, isn't it? Because the mainstream media is actually a daily cycle of racism, sexism, bigotry on every sort of level. For example, Donald Trump, Salvini, Le Pen, Viktor Orban in Hungary, the AfD in Germany, the list goes on. These are far-right politicians that actually, far from being in the fringes and not able to affect mainstream popular opinion, they're actually able to shape both foreign and domestic policy around immigration, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, abortion rights, and LGBT plus rights. And actually, I think it's important for us as the left to make this point, that actually, more often than not, it is not the right that have their views curtailed by the system, but it's actually the left. The left, every time they organise in any sort of way against the status quo, whether that's solidarity with the Palestinians, whether that's for women to have abortion rights on demand, the system absolutely, as a system, clamps down on them. So, for example, when Bolsonaro was elected as president in Brazil, a horrible day, the Brazilian Donald Trump, as he nicknamed himself, on the first day that he was elected, 34 universities were invaded by the Brazilian military. Key activists were arrested, some of which have never been found since. And what did they do? They burned Marxist and anti-fascist literature. That's an attack of the right on the left. For example, in the USA, the so-called land of the free. People have seen the inspiring movement on the streets of the Black Lives Matter movement against the daily cycle, the vicious cycle of policemen gunning down black and brown people in the streets on a daily basis. On the back of that mass campaign, you would have seen, you had NFL footballers, people like Colin Kaepernick and others, who actually in protest, in a peaceful protest against what is an institutionally racist system, took a knee during the American anthem. Trump and the American establishment started to attack these people, said that they were shitting on the memory of veterans, said that they were unpatriotic, and actually in the end, the American system, headed up by Donald Trump, working with NFL bosses who ran the NFL club, colluded to make sure that anyone who took a knee did not get a renewed contract. In other words, would not be able to play football, American football again. And I think here in Britain you can see similar processes take place. And there are lots of examples that people might want to bring out in the discussion. But when you think about prevent legislation on campus, we heard from David Marushu at the opening rally yesterday at Marxism, where even any sort of protest against prevent leads you to be a sackable offence. When you think about the inspiring protest of the Youth Strike for Climate, or XR, you immediately see that the state, as a tactic to stop left-wing protests occupying with massively brilliantly pink boats in the middle of Oxford Circus, the state arrests people. And I think it's interesting to see that when those people were arrested, the first line that is said by the police is that no one will face any charges. What's come out now is that those people in XR who have been arrested are now going to face some sort of charges. So in other words, there is an absolute pushing from the state to put a ban on you to make sure that those protests, if you go to those protests, you break your bail conditions and it cuts down on the effectiveness of it. But the main example I wanted to use here in the UK, and I think it's a very pertinent example, is the question of the anti-Semitism argument that is going on, that is being driven. Now, the question of anti-Semitism is a very real thing. Anti-Semitism is on the rise, but it isn't people like Jeremy Corbyn or the left that are the main threat, that are the threat to Jewish people across the world. the far right, in its entirety, from Donald Trump to Bolsonaro to Viktor Orban in Hungary, are anti-Semitic to its core. Anti-Semitic attacks are on the rise across Europe, but it is in countries where the far right have some sort of footing. Now, the question of anti-Semitism on the left, so-called anti-Semitism on the left, was crystallised around the issue of the IHRA definition. The IHRA definition effectively labels anyone who criticises Israel's domestic or foreign policy as anti-Semitic. This was adopted by both the Labour Party, by local councils, by different organisations and institutions. And I think we have to be absolutely clear about it. This is a hammer blow to the Palestinian movement across the world. There is absolutely, we have the right to discuss, to debate, and to be against Israeli snipers shooting dead Palestinian children on the border of the Palestinian on the Palestinian border. It's an absolute. And you see, it's been used as a weapon to attack Jeremy Corbyn. It's been used as a weapon to attack the emerging movement around Jeremy Corbyn. Shockingly, by people who are supposed to have had the same aims as Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party. It's absolutely scary when you see the other candidate for Prime Minister, Jeremy Hunt, getting up on the radio or the TV, and it actually made your blood boil when you hear it. He said, I went to Auschwitz a couple years ago, and I flippantly thought this could never happen in Britain. And then I saw Jeremy Corbyn. In other words, comparing one of the most principled anti-racists you have in the House of Commons, who has been on the streets against the EDL, the NF, and so on, you then have the mad contradiction of really an institutionally racist organisation, the Tory party, accusing the only anti-racist in the House of, one of the only anti-racists in the House of Commons as being racist. So that's a terrifying prospect, and like I said, it's a hammer blow to the Palestinian movement. Since Facebook has adopted the IHRA definition, 32,000 Facebook profiles, both personal and political, this year have been shut down. Some have been reopened, the majority haven't. This shows you how the debate around free speech, far from the right being attacked, is actually progressive movements that are always on the sharp end of a crackdown around free speech on every single level. And there's lots of numerous other examples that can be used. Another clear example is what's going on in France. The French state claims to be a secular state and enforces that on its citizens. What that means is that in the name of free speech and women's liberation, Muslim women are forced to not wear the hijab or the burqa. I mean, people would have seen a couple of years ago the disgusting images that came out of the beach on France, where you had two armed police officers standing over a Muslim woman in the name of women's liberation, telling her to undress. This is the shocking sort of element that you have around these issues. And that's where the question around free speech can be even more sort of contested, the issue of the campuses. You see, for the first time in decades, we are seeing a concerted attempt from the far right to get a foothold on the campuses. Free speech societies have been popping up at universities across the country. We have to be clear about it. Fascist forces at the centre of it, but they're not going to get up and say we're going to start a fascist society in honour of Hitler or Mussolini or whatever. They use the question of free speech to provide a sort of respectable face to what is actually, what is their real racism and their bigoted ideas. And there are two main groups that I wanted to highlight, one of which I don't know that much about and have recently sprung onto the scene, a group called Turning Point USA, which I know there are people from the USA here and people should speak about it, and the other one was Generation Identity, which is much more a pan-European organisation which is trying to mobilise in light of the so-called refugee crisis. Turning Point USA effectively is an organisation that have been buoyed up by Trumpism in the UK and effectively hold almost staged sort of meetings where they try and legitimise transphobia, racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and so on. I don't know if people have seen it's an interview that's done the rounds on Facebook and YouTube. It's an interview with their founding member, Ben Shapiro, who went on BBC, was interviewed by, I think, Jonathan Neal, and Ben Shapiro ended up accusing Jonathan Neal as being a sort of left-wing, sort of biased, and left-wing biased, and he should be ashamed of it. I mean, even Jonathan Neal laughed at the absurdity of this. Andrew Neal. Sorry, not Jonathan Neal. God, that's embarrassing. It's socialism in action there, you see. And what the Turning Point USA effectively do is they set up these sort of debates which are filmed. And actually, I think I have a lot of respect for the people that go in there, left-wing students that go in there and debate them. But actually, the real problem is actually that those left-wing students are ridiculed online and stuff. I mean, there was one person, I'm sure he gets 10 points for trying, but actually he started talking to Ben Shapiro about if I owned, about how he worked in a matchbook factory, and that actually, it was this whole sort of analogy of socialism that Ben Shapiro absolutely sort of destroyed. But you see, it was a false sort of argument, and what they do is they end up cutting out a lot of the stuff, a lot of the real sort of debates and arguments, and they set up into really on the one-sided, on the side of Turning Point USA and Shapiro. And you see, here in Europe, we have a group called Generation Identity. Generation Identity will be known for raising £160,000 to commandeer a ship to sink refugee vessels as they crossed the Mediterranean. Their main ideological argument is that European values, Christian values, are under siege by black and brown people coming from the Middle East, from North Africa, and so on. They argue that the so-called refugee crisis is a Jewish plot planned up by George Soros, where you can see how the newer form of racism around Islamophobia absolutely opens up the door to the older forms of racism around anti-Semitism. And they're connected with the US alt-right. The leader of GI is seen to have sent money to the Christchurch shooter, who tragically shot dead Muslim worshippers in Christchurch. And you see, what's interesting, here they still have a relatively small group. Their last demonstration in 2018 only had 40 people on it, but they've had regular presences at the Free Tommy Robinson rallies, and they seem to be part of an emerging alt-right element here in the UK. And actually, even for a group that are quite small, they are still quite active. It's brilliant to see that comrades from the UCU initiated a newsletter which sent round information about GI and their activity on the campuses. 24 different universities have seen activity from this far-right group. The sort of activity like racist stickers, graffiti, stunts, they've tried to hold some meetings, and so on. And you see, I think this is where the question of the old argument around no platforming fascists is really an important argument that the left need to revisit. You see, I am for no platforming fascists. I do not think that providing any sort of oxygen or legitimising the views of Tommy Robinson or the far right in any sort of way is a good thing. But you see, on the campuses, I don't think it's a clear-cut thing, because actually, what you have is the sort of situation where the people who are protested on campus, people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, like Katie Hopkins, and so on, even though they're just protested, like leafleted against and so on, they claim that to be no platformed. When actually, to be honest, that raises a big issue, doesn't it? Whereas actually, my argument around no platform is that we don't allow them to actually hold a meeting or spread their arguments. You see, the real problem that you have is the institutions like Cambridge University, Oxford Union, and so on, constantly, on nearly a monthly basis, invite far-right ideologues like Marine Le Pen and so on to come to speak on their campuses. And you see, for me, one of the highlights of the summer was to see the far-right poster boy, Tommy Robinson, being hounded from one end of the northwest to the other, covered in milkshake most of the time. And that was, for me, a highlight of the summer. People would have seen that I'm proud to say that comrades in the SWP, working with broader forces around Stand Up to Racism, the trade unions, the Labour Party, and so on, built a massive campaign against that far-right ideologue. And people would have seen, I have to give a shout-out to him, Paul Jenkins, who's an organiser for Unite Against Fascism in the Northwest, got the nickname Megaphone Man, because he was part of that video where Tommy Robinson came to his hometown in Barrow, and he wouldn't shake his hand, he wouldn't speak to him, he wouldn't get into a conversation with him. He called him a Nazi over and over and over again. And you see, what I found interesting is I was sitting up on election night, really worried that we were going to have Tommy Robinson as our MEP in the Northwest, and so on. Brilliant to see that he left it early and only got 2.2% or whatever it was. But you see, Tommy Robinson, justified himself how no platforming works. He said, I thought I ran a really good campaign. I thought I spoke to a lot of people. The real problem was, everywhere I went, I was called a Nazi. I was called a Nazi, and I don't understand this. And what's so interesting about that, that validates the question of no platforming as a tactic. And you see, I think we have to employ this tactic against fascist groups on campus in every single way that we can. Building mass campaigns on the campuses, leafleting against them, raising awareness with them, working with our lecturer comrades together on the campuses to provide a space in which the far right are not accepted. Because, you see, if you can draw one lesson from what's gone on from the continent compared to here in Britain, is that why is it that the far right do find it so difficult to build here in the UK? It's because there are organisations across the country that every time the far right show up, every time the far right try to spew their poison, they are there to call them what they are. They don't let them to be legitimised. And you see, the real tragedy of France, Austria, and other countries is really that actually the left have been too slow on this issue. They've allowed the far right to be legitimised. They've allowed the far right to be part of the mainstream. And actually, we have a chance here in the UK, while they're a small organisation, to make sure that they don't grow. I want to give two shout-outs to student groups across the country. The first one is at Wolverhampton University, where there has been an absolute hard effort from GI to build on that campus. And I want to say credit to the comrades at Wolves University. Every time those fascists put posters up on their campus, they would go around at the dead of night covering them with Stand Up to Racism stickers. It sent a clear message. It sent a clear message that fascism, racism in all of its forms is not welcome on our campuses or on our streets. And actually I think it's worth saying that the comrades in Wolves done that a lot of the time without the support of the student union. The student union abided by the policy that ignore these people and they will go away. And that's a dangerous, dangerous argument. The second shout out is that I want to give to Bristol. Because Bristol University showed another way in which a small group of revolutionaries on campus can absolutely pull together wider forces to take on the racism of GI and their fascism. GI, one of their sort of people that they adore, that they idolise, etc., is Enoch Powell, who made that horrible, Rivers of Blood speech. GI, in support of that speech, dyed the big fountain in Bristol red as a sort of protest against mass migration, against the displacement of white people in Europe, and so on. Comrades in Bristol, 2 days later, at very short notice, contacted the Labour Society, the trade unions on campus, the different organisations, and in 2 days' notice they had 100 people out saying no to generation identity and no to the poison that they push out. You see, that wouldn't have happened without revolutionaries at the forefront of the struggle pushing an argument that actually we will not allow racists to rear their ugly head, and every time they do, we will push them back to the gutter. Congratulations to Wolves and Bristol. The fight isn't over. GI will be back. But absolutely, what you have shown is a lesson that actually the rest of the left across Europe needs to learn from. is that actually racism and fascism is something that has to be delegitimised in every single way. And the final thing I'll say is this, is that we live in a period, we live through the longest economic crisis since the 1930s. And like the 1930s, racism and fascism, sexism and bigotry are on the rise. Now, this isn't because I think people wake up one day and they say, oh, I'm going to blame my Muslim neighbour, my black neighbour for the problems in society. But actually, I think it's because if you haven't got any money in your pockets, if it's difficult to provide food on the table for your family or a roof over the head for your family, you are going to look for someone to blame. And politicians like Theresa May, like Boris Johnson, like Tony Blair, like Gordon Brown, those people have systematically, for decades, tried to win the argument that the people to blame are refugees and migrants. And we are the ones that I think have to take on that argument. You see, people have mentioned throughout Marxism, and it's a theme that's run through right from the opening rally, that we live in a polarised society. It's true that the far right are growing. It's true that the far right are making gains. But that polarisation is going to the left as well. At Marxism, we saw this whole argument that the far right push out, that Muslim women are somehow intimidated by their male counterparts. Just look at that speaker from Sudan. Look at that speaker from Sudan. Look at the Sudanese women who are leading the revolutionary struggle in Sudan. Look at the Algerians building on that sort of movement. That's where the hope lies in the society that we live at the moment. Look at the students leading the question over climate change. 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds. These people disagree with Tommy Robinson, with Donald Trump, on every single level. We need to shun the despair that GI and the far right represent. Those people are the future.
Okay, so if you would like to indicate, if you would like to make a contribution or discussion, I'm going to call you in twos, so I'll call the comrade in the pink t-shirt first, with the comrade in the orange at the back, and the rest of you keep your hands up and I'll make some kind of, hopefully, non-traumatic description of you. Okay, thank you.
Hi, so I'm from the United States, and I just wanted to talk a minute about the alt-right and free speech issues in the States. And so I think one of the most interesting things is this hypocrisy within the notion of free speech on the alt-right, especially within the States, right? So you have, people on the alt-right who are like, well, I can say racial slurs because it's free speech, or like, Ben Shapiro, who had that debate a few years ago with Zoe Tur, who is a trans journalist, where he kept misgendering her and defended it. It was like, well, it's my free speech to say that thing, or Milo coming to Yiannopoulos coming to campuses and spreading his hate, and that's all free speech, right? But when you turn around and people on the left, and like, there's, drag queens who are hosting reading sessions at libraries, or when anti-fascists, post the information of neo-Nazis, or when people spread videos of people being racist and they end up getting fired for it, then that's not free speech anymore, right? Then that's harassment and targeting. So it's like not only is the alt-right claiming this sort of free speech thing to justify their fascist beliefs, but they're not even consistent about it. It's not that they want free speech, it's that they want their free speech and not everyone else's free speech. And I think perhaps one of the things that you briefly mentioned, the distinction between free speech and hate speech. And I think one of the things I struggle with the most in the States is that distinction just does not exist at all in the US. Is that any time we talk about censoring hate speech is turned into well, there's a free speech issue, and then we won't have free speech. But like, other countries have hate speech legislation, and well, surprise, surprise, people are still able to talk about things. But it's like, in the US, we can't even get past like the notion that like, hey, if you say the N-word, you should get in trouble. Like, it's that low of a bar. And so I think we need, I don't know what we need, but I think we need to start realizing that just because you have the right to say something doesn't mean that you should be free from consequences for saying it.
Absolutely.
Comrade in the orange, followed by the comrade in the green LMHL t-shirt.
Okay. Thank you. I would like to give some little perspective from France. I already apologize for my approximative English. But so, you know, in France we have this big fascist party who exists since 40 years, made 11 million votes in the last presidential elections. Marine Le Pen, former Front National, now named Rassemblement National, which is like the main fascist party, but which is also linked with some smaller Nazi street groups, fighting groups. And in France, there is the question of no platform for Nazis is really a political fight, because in the left we have this left populism who say don't pay attention to the far right, don't fight them because you give them like importance. And we fight against this view, and I come from Strasbourg, and this political mistake from the left had a lot of consequences in mobilization. For instance, we had fascists in Strasbourg in the last 5 years trying to engage in climate change mobilization, trying to debate in the university, trying to open places near the campuses to establish in the university. And each time we had to convince our partners on the left that we shall not tolerate their presence. So, for example, during the debate, the university invited Bruno Gollnisch, who was the number 2 of the Front National, which is a Nazi, who was condemned in trial for denying the Holocaust. And after that, he was invited by the university. We didn't tolerate that. We gathered and we just made the debate cancel. We made so much noise. But they didn't stop at that moment. That 2 years after, there was like another group, its name is Bastion Social. They are like generation identity, like similar group, linked to the Front National, and they try to locate like just next to the campus, and we, in less than 1 year, we mobilized several times. We made 100 people in the street, we demonstrate in the street of their places, and in less than 1 year, we made them close, and our last meeting was in the university, in the very room we made Gollnisch out. So it's very important to say, no platform for Nazis, not in the street, not in the universities, and not in our demonstrations.
Contributions to 3 minutes. We've got quite a lot of hands, so everyone's been good so far. Also, I'm not necessarily going to call you in the order that I made eye contact with you, just to keep the flow of people as diverse as possible. So, comrade in the green LMHL T-shirt, followed by the comrade in black with the glasses.
Hello, my name is Robert. I'm the branch secretary for the United Union at the Church's Hospital in Tooting. I just want to add to what Paddy was saying about anti-Semitism and the Labour Party, because the point I want to make, it's not just Palestine solidarity people they're going for, they're also going for trade union activists, including members of Unite the Union. It's just a witch hunt. It's like McCarthyism, but some of the trade unions, including Unite, are backing this definition of anti-Semitism. We have to fight in the trade unions. It's absolutely right, we're going for people like Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson, but we can't let people like Margaret Hodge and Tom Watson off the hook. And the point of the hijab, just want to say, if women have been in Iran for not wearing the hijab, we also have to condemn that. We have to condemn the Saudi Arabian royal family for beheading journalists. But they're entitled to free speech in Saudi Arabia as well as anywhere else. So, thank you.
So the comrade in the black, who will be followed by the comrade in the white here.
Hello, bringing greetings from Aotearoa in New Zealand, and thank you to all the comrades who stood in solidarity with New Zealand after the shooting on March the 15th in the mosque. It was really important for that international solidarity. And I suppose, and I know there was a lot of newspaper coverage about how amazing our Prime Minister was, and I guess in comparison to most people's Prime Ministers, you can really imagine Theresa May doing that, right? But again, it's really interesting that it looks, the way that it was portrayed, New Zealand has this outpouring of grief, we're all really anti-racist, this isn't us. Subsequent to that, so, and particularly after the initial memorial service and the playing of the call to prayer at the start of Parliament one day, the Prime Minister has received death threats from the far right. The our mayor in Auckland, Phil Goff, who was the one who prevented two of the alt-right speakers, Laura Southern and the other one, from using council venues to spread hate speech. Last year he has, and he went to visit a mosque recently, he's received death threats. So this isn't, it's not isolated to here, it's not just in Europe, this is an international thing. But the thing I wanted to focus a little bit on is the anti-Semitism, because it's been really shocking seeing what's happening with Jeremy Corbyn, but also this is being used in New Zealand to try to divide the movement against Islamophobia, so out on the original protests, because there were anti-racist protests in support of the Muslim community after the shooting. People attempted to divide those by calling people supporting Muslims anti-Semites, and I think it just seems it's a really convenient way to really wrong foot the left, because it's one of the things that is particularly hurtful to us, I think, as revolutionaries, as anti-racists, and people who stand in that tradition. Being called anti-Semitic is a really difficult thing, and so it's really important that we stand together and we try and understand where that's coming from. I also just wanted to bring had a memory almost 25 years ago at Edinburgh University that we got the racist lecturer Chris Brand sacked, and so solidarity to all those university students fighting racism on campus. It can be a long, hard struggle, but the way that it raises people's heads, getting unions involved, getting the students involved, and making people realise that you can make a change, you can make your campus a place where you want to study is a really vital thing, so stick at it, comrades.
Here at the front, who will be followed by the comrade in the multicoloured dress.
Hello, I'm also wanting to talk about anti-Semitism because locally, Canachos, where I'm from, anti-Semitism is the flavour of the month. Mainly because it's a very right-wing area, and the few left people they've got, like myself, they are trying to use anti-Semitism because it's the only thing they think they can try and use against us. We've had a member. There's a big argument at the moment. We've had members that have been kicked out for stating that Israel is a murderous state. They've been kicked out for that being anti-Semitism. Also, we've had people that have been now kicked out for sharing posts saying in solidarity with Chris Williamson. And when we confront the right wing of the party, of the Labour Party, and even councillors themselves, who have openly said to us that they want Corbyn members to F off, these are councillors, they say that it's their free speech, and I think that this is where free speech goes out the window in some ways, because if they're a Labour councillor or a councillor, you can't stand there and slag Corbyn off and say they slag the Labour policies off, and also try and kick members out of the party for supporting Corbyn. But the main thing at the moment is anti-Semitism, and then it's causing a lot of grief because that's how they're trying to get rid of the left. So yeah.
Comrade in the multicolour, who will be followed by the comrade in the blue shirt.
Well, I think in terms of our attitude towards the far right and the question of free speech, I think the starting point doesn't need to be to make a differentiation between hate speech and free speech. The starting point is to say the far right are not denied free speech in any way, shape or form. The far right disproportionately have their views promoted. They're the people who are given platforms, not just at universities but by politicians. They have Donald Trump in the White House acting as their mouthpiece in places all throughout Europe. They are in government now, in places where they're not in government. They are part of form major political parties that are given free time in the newspaper, on TV, to organise their own political meetings all of the time. So the far right, their speech is not under attack. And it's not just, they put forward a particular kind of speech. Their speech, I think, is very self-consciously promoted by the capitalist class and by other right-wing governments. And so we stand against what they have to say, and we recognise that there's a counterposition, I think, between the way their free speech is promoted and the way the speech of the massive people, the oppressed, the dispossessed and the working class is stymied and denied. And we can see a whole series of different examples of that. All through the last couple of years, you've seen massive increases, not just in the general authoritarianism of governments all around the world, but all of the restrictions around what workers are allowed to say, at their workplaces, whether it's criticising your workplace or taking up political positions, restrictions around what people are allowed to do on university campuses, restrictions around the right to protest and the right for people to collectively organise. And so I think we have to say that the battle, as Paddy said, all throughout human history, the left has been the group that has battled for the expansion of free speech, not just against the far right, but against the establishment. And that's the battle that we are still part of today. And the only way that we can express our free speech is collectively, and is through things like demonstrations. I think in some ways, I think the term no platforming is not that useful in terms of talking about the protests against the far right today, because no platforming used to mean that we in all cases had the numbers to shut down the far right. Obviously that's not the reality often today, and I think sometimes that can push people towards wanting to look towards right-wing institutions, be it governments or university, student union bureaucracies or whatever, to get them to ban people from campuses. I think that's not what we're for. We're not for empowering the same institutions that actually back up and support the rights of the far right. We're for empowering the massive ordinary people to collectively organise. So the examples of the comrades organising on campuses, organising protests, taking a stand, I think that's our political starting point in terms of trying to battle against the not free speech, the dominant right-wing ideas in society, and through that it's a process of us organising people politically and collectively, and that's a real expression of free speech.
Will be followed by the comrade in the team shirt with the glasses.
Yeah, I think one of the things that annoys me about free speech, we found out last month that when leave doesn't mean leave for Boris when it's his girlfriend telling him to get out of her flat. Like he's been abusive to her, as far as we can make out. But when the media then round on the people who reported it, saying it was a private conversation, you cannot have a private conversation if no neighbours are recording it on an ordinary phone in their flat. And the fact that the woman didn't know was still there when he was still there when the police turned up, and so she couldn't obviously say anything. She didn't know it was recorded. It's unbelievable the position that this idea that they want to shut down the right of people to even report what they're doing, the establishment are doing, and then they want to protect them and attack the people who report what they're up to. It's very clear that free speech means the freedom for them to do what they want, not be reported on, and it's not the free speech for us to tell our side of the story and to support those being victimised by it.
In the team shirt with the glasses, who will be followed by the comrade in the black t-shirt.
Right, so I'm from Bristol, Swiss, and Paddy mentioned one of the things that's happened in the last year. But there's another thing I want to tell you about, which is we listen to this society on our campus called Free Speech Society. So they're basically a right-wing group who use the guise of free speech to talk about anything they want to, including at one point inviting an Islamophobic speaker from the Henry Jackson Society to add insult to injury in the weeks after the New Zealand shooting. So in response to this, Swiss and various other groups on campus organised a protest. Unfortunately, the SU did step in and cancelled the event on the grounds that there wasn't an opposing speaker. However, it is, I think, important to note that this society, despite planning this and then going ahead in a secret location and live streaming this speaker, their existence is still allowed by RSU because they are free speech and therefore they can continue to speak about whatever they want.
So comrade here, who'll be followed by the comrade in the green in the corner.
Is it okay if I'm not filmed? I just don't feel comfortable.
Yeah, sorry, I should have said if anybody doesn't want to be filmed, they can say and we'll turn everything off. Sorry, I should have said that earlier.
Thank you for sharing all the experience of actions. I would like to hear some more about that because I'm from the Netherlands, and you mentioned correctly that we could use like far more movements like everywhere in Europe. But in the Netherlands, it's kind of a different story. We have left-wing parties who are aiming for a government seat, and they don't want to be anti-racist because that's against the current climate of the very right-wing rhetoric right now. So they actually were working together with action groups on a platform, and then they got pressured by the far right, and they left the platform saying that it was too tacky to be anti-racist basically right now. So I was wondering if this is the case with us now, how can we broaden this no platforming tactic also with regard to what the person in the speaker in the address said about you shouldn't trust in boards to ban these right wing. You should organize, and in that way we do have a discussion because we want to organize broadly, but it's kind of hard going in with these parties who are also some organizations who receive subsidizement, so then they also can't really speak out. And we also have people on the autonomous side who are rightly very pissed, but sometimes want to be more in confrontation with these right-wingers. But that isn't very attractive to people with children, or it's not really an accessible protest, so to speak. One of these groups targeted a right-winger's door. Well, I don't really have a problem with it, but the general public then sees like graffiti and stuff. Is not so accessible, and it doesn't bring out their ideas. So that was my question. And I have one positive example. There was a queer pride in Groningen where they actually managed to turn it around and say, well, we want to be a good space for marginalized groups to be in. And the general rhetoric is right-wing, so we don't allow right-wing and racists here. We want them to have a space for change because society doesn't offer this to them. And I thought that was a good basic point, because the ideas we have right now are not neutral. They are the ideas of the ruling class. So yeah, we have an argument for that.
So comrade in the green will be followed by the comrade in the black here.
Hi. So I want to talk about there seems to be an argument that goes around, often by libertarians, especially individuals such as Brendan O'Neill, who argue that free speech can be used as a method to defeat fascism. And I think this is a really, really naive view. There's an interesting book, people seem to be binge reading it at the moment because of Trump, but I think it's worth reading. It's a flawed book. It's by Hannah Arendt, it's called The Origins of Totalitarianism. In it, she makes the argument that during the rise of fascism in the 20th century, there was a certain type of intelligent and well-meaning liberal, but their intelligence actually created a kind of stupidity, because they sincerely thought that if they just fact-checked or just debated with fascists, and by debating with fascists that they could then hone their arguments and perfect their arguments against fascism. They thought that just by perfecting their argument, by perfecting the skill of rhetoric, they could defeat fascism. What they forgot, however, was that fascism is actually not merely an opinion, it's a mass movement. So even if they may have trounced fascists in debate, which I'm sure they did, it probably didn't amount to much other than maybe a few egos being destroyed. And in that sense, that's why you actually have to approach fascism as if it is a mass movement, because that's what it is. Yeah. So you have to use the tactic of no platform, you have to break at their meetings, you have to organise them, you have to embarrass them and so on. But I think it's worth asking the question, when liberals say we want to debate fascists, what do they want? Like, do they imagine that we get a town hall with like 100 people in it? On one side we put someone who says, I actually really like the Holocaust. And then on the other side you put someone who says, actually no, I don't like the Holocaust. And then everyone listens to the arguments. and they stroke their chins, and at the end maybe they drink orange juice and have nibbles or something. I mean, this is just fucking stupid. This is ridiculous. Just as a final point, I feel like this is an absurd thing. A friend of mine once said that debating fascists is a bit like attempting to play chess with a squirrel. Like, you can try, it'll probably go nowhere, and you might get pounced on. So, yeah, please milkshake them, don't chat to them.
Comrade here in the black, followed by the comrade in the grey right at the back. This is not a fitness plan for you, Ruby.
I'm a student, recently graduated from the University of Wolverhampton, and like Paddy did say, last year in October, Generation Identity did poster on our campus in the middle of the night on a Sunday with Enoch Powell imagery, which was a pathetic attempt to try and revive, Enoch Powell's legacy in the constituency that he once represented. The posters were down within an hour, and when they tried to get back up, we got better at it to the point where we actually followed the Generation Identity UK leader, moving the posters down as he went along. But this was, an embarrassing attempt to try and revive his legacy after the fantastic campaign by Stand Up to Racism to get rid of the blue plaque that our History Society wanted to get up for Enoch Powell's legacy. But we won that campaign, we got rid of it, and we won't let the Generation Identity make plans with this. But Lars Marxism actually said that I never want to talk about Powell again. But the fact is, Tories involved in far-right politics, and how dare these Nazi hipsters try and rear their head in Wolves, multicultural city, which was recently said to be the most anti-racist city in the UK. But also, how dare Owen Jones and the rest of the Labour right try and actually compare Corbyn and Williamson to actual anti-Semites that are opposed every day going into university. We need to be clear on who the fascists are, and we need to mobilise against them, not turn on our own comrades. Yesterday, or the day before, whenever it was, Tommy Robinson only got 80 people outside of his court hearing. The fact is, I want to make very clear to comrades in this room, we shall not give up until there's not a sight of them left. We will not give them space, because fascist ideas will grow, and they will attack our campuses, just like Jobbik have attacked the gender studies course and the arts courses in the university in Central Europe.
At the back, followed by the comrade with the long hair in the corner.
Hello. Yeah, this is just sort of bouncing off what the comrade down the front right said a minute ago, with a sort of more contemporary example. A lot of people say that you have to debate with fascists and Nazis, and that then they will be shamed, and you will show them to be what they really are. Like that will solve it. And an example that's often used is Nick Griffin being interviewed. I assume it was on the BBC, and how he came away from that being completely exposed and shamed. But the result actually was that he had an incredible turnout that year, because the point of going on for the interview was not to make arguments, but was to gain legitimacy. And he was granted legitimacy by being given that platform. And so I think we just have to remember that we might have an idea that somebody's been exposed, but actually the result of it can be that they get a much, much better electoral turnout than they would have done had they not had that publicity. And so it's the publicity really that people see. They see somebody on the BBC and they think, oh, here's somebody who I should listen to. So yeah, I think that's worth it.
Sorry, there was an announcement which I forgot. Ruby, could you read out that announcement that you showed me?
Found it.
Oh, they found it.
Yeah,
Sorry, there was an announcement to go to the crash. Sorry, forgot. So, comrade in the corner, he'll be followed by the comrade down here in front.
I'm speaking from South Africa, so different kind of perspective. But we luckily have legislation against hate speech where I'm from. And I guess you could call that lucky because it's due to sort of historical. But in the recent democratic elections, this political party called the VF, which is actually historically quite apartheid-esque, won a few seats. And I think that's just indicative of the push to the far right felt absolutely all over the world, and how important it is that resistance begins, and it begins fast. And there's a phrase in South Africa, never again, and that sort of becomes weightless because if there is no activism against it, the history just starts creeping into the present.
Okay, so it's the comrade down here who'll be the last speaker. Sorry, we've run out of time, and then I'm going to call Paddy back. The comrade in the right.
There was this by the German Bundestag 1 month or 2 months ago, which said that BDS is anti-Semitic. It has absolutely no legal bearing, and it wasn't supposed to have a legal bearing. What it's about is, it came after a series of Palestinian speakers having their visa removed or having the rooms where they're due to speak being unbooked, and was followed by the rapper Tyler Quake, who was uninvited from a festival, and all sorts of further speakers having problems being able to stand up and talk about Palestine. There's two things to learn about that. The one is that simply asking for the government or the state to ban racists is a problem when it's the state who decides who the racists are. That if the state decides that BDS is racial, that Jeremy Corbyn is a racist, it's not sufficient for us to just say racist. But the second is, the reason why this ban could happen at all was because in the last generation there's been very little discussion in Germany about Palestine because of German history, and there wasn't the opposition there. It was the lack of debate which meant that there was the inability to resist this uncertainty. So generally speaking, we are for free speech. Generally speaking, we are for everyone's able to say. And I think if you're talking about no platform, you will need to be very specific about it. And I wouldn't conflate racism and fascism. That we are for every time a racist gets up, every time a transphobe gets up, standing up, challenging them, telling them why they're wrong, telling the audience what they're wrong. I'm not for no platform. No platform is a specific strategy for when the words of free speech of people will lead to violent action. So to be used against fascists and very few other people. And I'd also say there's a difference between the right-wing who are in governments and organised, and Tommy Robinson, and organised Nazis. We won't stop the right wing. We won't get the numbers to stop the right wing who government no platform. Actually, hopefully, we're in a situation still where we can get the numbers to stop Tommy Robinson speaking, to stop the BNP speaking, and people like that. I think it's come this. I mean, no one's mentioned the trans debate, but it's come this in the trans debate where sometimes our side chooses to use the tactic of no platform against everybody we don't like or everybody who has opinions in it. It is a specific tactic to use against specific people, and if we use against specific people, then we do get the numbers on our side, and we do actually manage to stop these people from speaking and from committing violent actions afterwards.
So, Paddy, would you like to sum up?
Well, I'll try. Look, a lot of ground's covered there. Sorry if I don't come back to your point. But look, I think the question about liberals is really interesting, because actually, you raised the question about what do they think is going to happen. I think it's more that liberals, as an ideology, have actually a sort of trust in the capitalist bourgeois democracy, that actually bourgeois democracy will be a defence against fascism. And actually what you see is that every time capitalist democracy or capitalism goes into crisis, actually fascism rears its head as a viable political alternative, doesn't it? The racism, the fascism, etc. is used to keep people whose living standards have been downtrodden for years and years and years, angry at each other rather than those angry at the top of society who are to actually blame with it. And you see, I think it's interesting, isn't it? When the whole milkshake saga came out in the Northwest, the same liberals who would say, I defend your right to say whatever you want, then condemn the violence of the left for using milkshakes against a fascist who is inciting violence against Muslims. You know what I mean? You can see the absolute knots that liberalism gets you in over this issue. And I think, look, on the issue of no platforming, I think, like I said in the main sort of talk, I do think the issue of no platforming and the effectiveness of it around Tommy Robinson is there for all to see. You know, it was only a couple months ago that Tommy Robinson was the poster boy of the far right around the world. He thought he was going to win an MEP seat in the northwest. Now it looks like he's going down. You know, with 80 people outside of the court. You know what I mean? That's something that's a good thing that's happened. But I think I want to labour the point. There was nothing automatic about that process. You know, actually, it takes the left organising on a broad basis, but I would argue with revolutionaries at the centre of it, really to take on that argument and push Tommy Robinson back to the gutter where he belongs. And I don't think we should rest on our laurels, though. There'll be another upsurge, there'll be another more fascists that will come out, and actually we have to learn from the processes that we've done in the past, taking on the NF, taking on the BNP, Tommy Robinson, and so on, because actually there's a reason why here in the UK, fascism, fascism like Tommy Robinson and so on, stays relatively marginalised. You know, there is a process there around the United Front, putting together the broadest possible forces on an anti-racist basis to take him on, and I think that's an important thing. You know, we should be proud of the role that we played around that. You see, I think the comrade from South Africa raises a really interesting point, and I think it shows you the limitations of going to institutions and the top of society, if you like, to win your battles. Because even though you have anti-hate legislation in South Africa, you have anti-hate legislation here, you have anti-hate legislation in a lot of countries, that doesn't stop the far right from organising on a massive scale, isn't it? Actually, what stops the far right, it goes back to that point of the United Front. It goes back to ordinary people like ourselves, black, white, gay, straight, Muslim, trans, whatever it is, coming together, linking arms, and saying we are one people, and you are actually the minority here. You know what I mean? I think, you know, people have raised it. I was in a meeting on violence, yesterday, which was a really interesting discussion. And someone raised the point about actually how many violent videos there are of racists abusing people on transport, you know, whether it's in the UK, the USA, or whatever. You see, I would flip the question around, though. I think it is terrifying to see how many of those videos come out in a massive sort of way. But in every single one of those videos, you always see someone saying, shut up with your racism. Those are the people that actually, the majority of people, reject that sort of racism, and that's the basis of our movement. We should feel confident with taking that anti-racist message out to the streets in a serious way. You know, the comrade from Bristol spoke really well about the free speech society, inviting someone from the Henry Jackson stuff. I mean, on one level, it does show you the confidence of these people. You know, to actually organise an Islamophobic event weeks after the Christchurch thing shows you it's both provocative, isn't it? But also there's a level of confidence to their ideas and stuff like that. And actually, it's an absolute disgrace that the Bristol Students' Union is allowing a group like that to exist. But you see, what's good? Why was that event pulled in the way that it was? It wasn't because the SU suddenly woke up and found a heart. It's because we had organised the demo. So we as the students at Bristol, we as the ordinary people on campus, put pressure on the institutions, and actually they listened to us on that time. And actually we're going to carry on having to do that in a big way. The comrade from France spoke absolutely brilliantly about the necessity of the no platform stuff, and I think, you know, solidarity to people in France is going to be a difficult battle, but what it shows you with those victories that you pave out, that actually it isn't the case that United Front strategy is an impossible thing that, you know, that you cannot do. Actually, it takes hard work, it's not easy, it's difficult, there are complications, but it's absolutely necessary. And when you take up that United Front strategy in a serious way, you can beat back the fascists. You know, so solidarity to France, and you know, I know it's a difficult situation over there. You have our full support from Marxism 2019. You see, and I think the comrade raises an interesting point about the language around no platforming. You see, I think we have to have clarity about what we mean about no platform. We want to starve the fascists of any sort of oxygen to grow. That is the basis. We want to stop them being legitimised. We want to stop them being in the mainstream. We don't want their racist and fascist ideas to be seen as ordinary sort of everyday occurrences. That's what the no platforming question is. You see, that sense of legitimacy is what the far right, since the 1930s and since the defeat of Hitler and so on, have actually been searching for on a mass sort of way. And they take different strategies and different tactics around it. There was Eurofascism that emerged. You know, you have the alt-right now, you have the populism of Trumpism, you have, so on and so on. And you see, the key argument I would say around fascism, and I think this is a good thing, history always proves it right, is that actually, what is the key thing that fascists want to do? They want to use democracy to destroy it. You know, that is their starting point. What was the first thing that Hitler done when he was elected Chancellor of the Reichstag? It was to ban all other political organisations within the Reichstag, and also the left groups, the trade unions, the communists, and so on. In other words, they will take power, and then they will use that power to cut off any sort of free speech, for want of a better word, against them. And I think that's the strategy of the fascists that we have to pave out, and that's the same sort of strategy that Tommy Robinson and people were trying to do around becoming an MEP in the North West. But you see, I do think that a question has to be raised. You see, I'm 28 now, yeah? I've been on a lot of anti-fascist demos, against different fascists. You see, actually, I'm almost tired of going on demonstrations just to be against something, just against you as a racist, just against you as a fascist. I know there are older comrades that must be even more tired than me in the room doing this. But you see, it does raise a question. Why do we live under a system that constantly throws up racism and fascism, almost in a cyclical way? I think it's something that's inbuilt in the system. Capitalism, as a system, does not solve these problems. It does not make life better for ordinary people. It is a system that is based on profit maximising for the rich at the expense of any sort of livelihood and decent living conditions for the poor. And actually, I think when we talk about revolution, when we talk about needing to overthrow the system, revolution can be seen as this sort of, it's painted out, isn't it, by capitalist academics and bourgeois politicians as being this sort of bloody, anarchic affair. Me as a revolutionary, I have a different term for a revolution, and that's called a festival of the oppressed. Now, what do I mean by that? It means that when, in any sort of real revolutionary process, those most downtrodden elements of society, so women, LGBT plus communities, ethnic and religious minorities, rise up, shake off the shackles that have been keeping them down for decades, and start to make the world anew. And that is exactly what we're seeing with the revolutionary process that is taking part in Sudan at the moment. The fact that in every single one of those videos, every single one of those pictures, it is women wearing the hijab leading the fight for a better world. And actually, in our own way, we in the SWP are wedded to that tradition. We want to see movements from below that start to shake off the muck of ages, those ideas that have kept people downtrodden. And if you agree with us, you should join us in that fight, because never more have we needed a different world from the brutal world that we live in today.